Hello and welcome. And joining me today to share the stories behind the 10 books that inspired her the most on her life journey is Riane Eisler, whose work has transformed organizations, policies, and people's lives worldwide. A recipient of the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award given earlier to the Dalai Lama and Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Riane Eisler is internationally known for her groundbreaking contributions as a cultural historian, systems scientist, futurist, attorney, consultant, speaker, and author of several best-selling books, including the iconic The Chalice and the Blade, which was hailed as the most important book since Darwin's Origin of Species. Two other books that I'm going to mention out of the many are The Real Wealth of Nations, which was held by Nobel Peace Laureate Desmond Tutu as a template for the better world we've been so urgently seeking, and Nurturing Our Humanity, which offers a radical and timely reminder that humanity's truest nature is oriented toward love, partnership, gender equality, and peace. Riane Eisler, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's good to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Tell me about your relationship with books and the role they've played in your life.
Well, books have been very important to me all my life. I was a curious child, and I guess I'm a curious person to this day. And reading books, it's like the opportunity to really talk and hear the ideas of people from all over the world and from all periods of time. Almost all periods. I mean, of course, not prehistory. We don't have deciphered writings for much of prehistory. So yes, books, I think, are very important, and it's something that I hope young people still will read.
Well, they did say that digital would kill books, but I don't think that's true. There are more books being published than ever, and I think, certainly all the children I know are very avid readers. So I think that they will stay with us for a long time. What was it like for you having to pick just 10?
Having to pick just 10 was difficult, as probably other people have told you. And I included some of my books too, because I learned a lot when I did the research and the writing of these books. But all the books that I mentioned, including the books by my wonderful husband, David Loy, have profoundly impacted my thinking, and I recommend them.
Well, I have to say that your books have profoundly impacted my thinking. And two in particular, well, actually three in particular, which we will get to discuss tonight. So let's have a look at the very first book. This is a book that I want to start with. You didn't put your list in any particular order, so I am going to start with this because it's a really important book. And it's a book that, truly groundbreaking book, that exposes the truths about sex that have been swept under the rug of religious dogma and scientific jargon, and the sexual myths that corrupted male and female relationships over the millennia. The book is Sacred Pleasure, Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body, New Paths to Power and Love. And you published that in 1995, I believe.
Yes, I did. And that wasn't the book I was planning to write. And in the prior book, which is the book I'm best known for, of course, The Chalice and the Blade, which is still going strong. It's in its 90th. I mean, it's just tremendous how many printings it's had in the United States and foreign editions. I promised a book called Breaking Free, and I started to write that, but there was one chapter that the folders just kept accumulating one, and it was on sexuality and on spirituality too. And I realized that was the book eventually when it became a box full, and I said, this is the book I'm going to write. But it struck me that there is this, well, and I start the book that way, if you remember, that flowers and candles and wine, these are the stuff of romance, of course, but they're also And this is what struck me so important in our most sacred rites. And so I wondered whether this yearning that people have today, many people, not everyone, of course, yet, for a sexuality that is more meaningful, that really is a caring connection, even some one night stand. It doesn't really. This book actually has an ethic for sexual relations. Think about that, and then think the adage "all's fair in love and war," which is ridiculous. I mean, of course, war is never fair, and to say that all's fair in love is crazy. So yes, and I discovered, going way back into the prehistory that is ignored, and the art and the clues that indeed there is this link, and there has been in the course of the shift from what I call a more partnership-oriented to a more domination-oriented way of living, a real transformation of both spirituality and sexuality, which so many trends today are trying to change and to go back, not to go back to any quote good old days, because these weren't perfect times, but to a more spiritual and a more pleasure and a more fulfilling both sexuality and spirituality.
Yes, and definitely a more equal partnership rather than domination, as you say. I mean, tell us briefly, for those that aren't familiar with your work, what is the difference between a domination society and a partnership society?
Well, when I started my research, which is really rooted in my personal experiences as and promise of being a refugee child with my parents from the Nazis when I was quite little, and I began to ask questions, is all this cruelty and all this violence really just human nature? We're told original sin or selfish genes, or are there alternatives? And if so, what are they? I realized that I couldn't answer this question many years later when I started my research by looking through the lenses of either conventional studies or conventional social categories, like right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, capitalist, socialist, because if you really think about it, there have been repressive and violent societies in every one of these categories. So none of them tell us what we need to build in order to have better lives and more satisfying and fulfilling lives for ourselves and our children and future generations. And I've also began, when I started to, and all of these categories either marginalize, ignore, or say that they are inferior the majority of humanity, women and children, family. And we know from neuroscience today that what children first experience and observe affects nothing less than how our brains, the architecture of our brains, and thus how we feel, how we act, how we think, how we vote. So this was big, and I began to see patterns that keep repeating themselves. So I called one the domination system, and the other one, I searched for a word, and I thought, well, a more mutuality, more mutual benefit, mutual accountability. And I thought of partnership system. And the difference between the two is I've identified four really characteristics. One is in a domination system, you have an authoritarian structure in both the family, because I include family in my work, contrary to conventional approaches, and the state, the tribe, the economic system, versus a more egalitarian and fairer and more caring system. Secondly, and again, this is ignored in conventional thinking, gender. Because why? Because in domination system, there's a very clear ranking of the male form over the female form, and no allowance for anything in between. None. very rigid gender stereotypes. And in a partnership system, you don't have that ranking. You have more of a linking. You still have hierarchies, but I call them we need new words, okay? I call them hierarchies of actualization, where responsibility, benefit, respect flows both ways rather than just from the bottom up, okay? And the third is violence. You know, to maintain these rigid rankings, whether it's man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, you have to have either abuse or the threat of abuse or the threat of violence. You have some violence because people lose it sometimes in partnership systems, but it's not needed. It's not built into the system. And fourth, and this is vital, very different worldviews, very different stories, very different language. While the partnership system, you recognize that we humans, yes, we have a capacity for violence, for cruelty. We see that. It is far less than our capacity for caring and our yearning for caring connection. And so the system doesn't idealize violence, doesn't idealize a quote masculinity that is equated with dominating, with conquest. Both men and women can reclaim their full humanity.
Did you write Sacred Pleasure before or after The Chalice and the Blade?
After The Chalice and the Blade. And as I said, I promised to write a very different book, but it became a book focusing on the transformation with the shift from, because for millennia, really first in gathering hunting societies, and then in the first agricultural societies, and then in Minoan Crete, and other more, quote, high civilizations, partnership was still retained, and we see it in the art. So I began to see these patterns, and they repeat themselves cross-culturally, historically. You see rigid domination systems, whether they're religious or secular. I mean, think of, for example, Nazi Hitler's Germany, rightist, secular, Stalin's former Soviet Union, leftist, secular, religious societies like the Taliban or Khomeini's Iran, or the so-called rightist fundamentalist alliance in the West. They fragment our consciousness. You know, these conventional categories. A colleague of mine calls our conventional categories weapons of mass distraction.
Yeah. So what changed? I mean, how did we move from partnership to domination?
Well,
what triggered that?
There are many theories about that. One of the most popular, well, there's some ridiculous theories, which is that when men found out that they have a role in reproduction, you know, they just became dominant and dominated, which really is a very dark view of the male psyche, isn't it? And actually, we have evidence. For example, there's a frieze from Çatalhöyük, which is one of the largest Neolithic or early agrarian sites in Turkey ever excavated, of a woman and a man in embrace, and then right next to them, the woman holding a baby. I mean, you know, it's like a lesson in sexuality, right? In reproduction. I mean, they understood that. So that theory is, but the most popular theory is came with agriculture. And indeed, we see agrarian societies that it came with private property, but there's also a lot of evidence, and today, for the theory proposed by the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas of, at least in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, of incursions of domination-oriented, really hurting people. And there are many clues to that, including DNA studies, which show that, for example, in what Gimbutas called the civilization of old Europe in the Balkans, where we find many partnership-oriented sites earlier, and then all of the people, a completely different DNA. So that the theory that it was through conquest is also on the table. And I think it was probably a combination of many things, but certainly conquest. And so the elevation of violence and armaments, and, you know, because these earlier civilizations had metals, but they didn't use them to make armaments, whereas the invaders certainly did. They really, as Gimbutas illustrates, they venerated, they worshipped the lethal power of the blade.
So is it then that when we stopped, being nomadic and started to settle down into one place, that then we started looking at ownership and wanting more?
Well, that's the theory that's popular, but that is not the theory that Gimbutas proposed.
Right.
I mean, Gimbutas proposed what the DNA evidence and a lot of the archaeological evidence shows, the disappearance. It wouldn't have disappeared. You know, these earlier cultures, the people, I mean, the DNA is different. Right. So, I mean, but whatever the reason was, there was, I have 2 chapters in the Chalice and the Blade called Reality Stood on Its Head. And I think that today we're trying to stand reality right side up again. And of course, I mean, whereas we have, as part of the sacred earlier art, even a woman giving birth, which we don't see in our art. Lots of images of people dying as martyrs and Jesus dying and, you know, the whole thing. The thing that's so fascinating is that today, I mean, for example, pregnancy. It used to be that a school teacher couldn't continue teaching just a short time ago if she was pregnant. And today we understand this is part of nature. And it's wonderful. I mean, it's a miracle giving birth.
Yeah.
So
lost touch with so much.
Yes, so we are, there are a lot of partnership trends, but they're not noticed. I mean, for example, the changing of gender stereotypes, the fluidity of gender roles and relations. These are partnership trends. The recognition that children have rights and that spanking and other forms of violence against children, which are built into domination systems. I mean, all of these systems that I mentioned, you know, whether it's the Taliban or Khomeini or Hitler or Stalin, women are inferior and to be dominated in families, even if, and they're not to rule, you know, but they're not matriarchies. See, this is, we're so conditioned, aren't we, that if it isn't patriarchy, it's matriarchy. But that's not, matriarchy and patriarchy are 2 sides of a domination coin. The real alternative is a partnership society.
Well, let's move on to your second book, which is The Delusions of Gender, How Our Mind, Society and Neurosexism Create Difference. And that was written by Cordelia Fine.
Cordelia Fine wrote a wonderful book, sort of debunking. Look, obviously there are physical, biological differences between male and female. But the question is that, and the problem, it's not just a question, is that so many writers seem to ignore socialization. And as I said, we know from neuroscience that what children observe, what children experience early on, the issue isn't genes, it is gene expression.
Yes.
And that happens in interaction with our cultural environments as humans. It's in interaction with our environments, of course, but for humans, so much of our environment is human made, it's cultural. And it has changed, and it can change again.
Yeah, absolutely. This particular book, it draws on the latest research in neuroscience and psychology to debunk the myth of hardwired differences between men's and women's brains. It's, it is such a stereotype, that men's brains aren't wired for empathy and women's brains are not, wired to fix cars or to be able to judge distance, etc. And it's not true.
Of course, it's not true. It really largely, there are differences. As I said, women lactate, women give birth, etc. But these are not the differences that are used as justification, as rationalizations for the kind of system that we have, which, as I said, male dominance is one of the characteristics. And why is that so important for the entire domination spectrum? Because it is something that teaches children early on to equate difference, beginning with the difference between the male and female form, with superiority or inferiority, with dominating or being dominated, with being served or serving. And this is the template for in-group versus out-group thinking. You can then apply it to a different race, a different religion, a different sexual orientation, and people do. There are these connections. See, when you look at society from a whole systems perspective, you can see these connections because you include these huge, I talk about connecting the dots, but these are not dots. Gender socialization is fundamental. So is parenting or caregiving of children. And we know that today, of course, from neuroscience, a so-called hard science.
Yes, indeed. Yes. Well, book number 3, there is a wonderful theme throughout all of your books, a beautiful arc. Book number 3 is The Human Potential for Peace, Challenge to Assumptions About War and Violence. And that was written by the renowned anthropologist Douglas Fry. What was it about that book that impressed you so much?
Well, I love that book because it's a collection of essays about our prehistory way back when we were, I call them gatherer hunters, because gathering was really more important in terms of the caloric intake. But it's foraging societies, really. And Doug Fry, he wrote, and we have a journal called the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies. And his article in it, for example, he calls these the original partnership societies. It's very important for us to know that this cartoon, the caveman cartoon that we show, think nothing of showing children before their brains, much less their critical faculties, are fully formed, is a lie. Think of what it teaches a child. In one hand, he's got a club, a weapon. With the other, he's dragging a woman by the hair. It's like, it's always been domination. There's always been male dominance. There's always been violence, right? Wrong. These societies, as I said, these are not completely violence-free societies, partnership-oriented societies, but it doesn't have to be built in to maintain rankings of man over man, man over woman, race over race, religion over religion, sexual orientation, the whole stuff. But we have to really see the whole picture. And this is why in the Chalice and the Blade, and also in Sacred Treasure, I look at so much at prehistory, at the archaeological finds, at the art, because art is a symbolic language. And it is not coincidental that the art of prehistory, and including the art of Minoan Crete, most of it focuses on nature, on life, female figures. Female figures, for example, in the Old Stone Age, that were called some weird form of pornography, or, they're faceless, they're full-bodied, big breasts, clearly etched vulva, possibly pregnant. These people the early archaeologists were really interpreting from their worldview. But I want to tell you that I invited Doug Fry to be my co-author. I had been working on my latest book, the one that was published by Oxford University Press, I guess it's almost a year and a half ago, to be my co-author. I had been working on it for 7 years. And then I invited him to be co-author precisely. Well, he's wonderful in many ways, but because he brings this big piece, all the research, he's one of the world's experts on foraging societies, both ancient and contemporary.
Yeah. Book number 4 is The Age of Empathy, Nature's Lessons for a Kinder Society. And this was by the acclaimed author of Our Inner Ape, Frans de Waal.
Yes. Well, as Frans de Waal points out, evolution would not have developed our capacity for empathy if it weren't a very important part of sentient human and really earlier forms of life too. And you see the empathy, but, and this is something where we come back to an analysis that uses the partnership domination social scale, because it's always a matter of degree, of course. You have the suppression or compartmentalization of empathy, as you have to in domination-oriented societies, because otherwise, how could you rule? How could you dominate?
Yeah.
How could you have these hierarchies of domination where people have to obey those on top, where those on top are privileged? And there are differences in status and in wealth. For example, Minoan society, which was already a, quote, high civilization, had the first paved roads in Europe, the first indoor plumbing, which always impresses Americans a lot. But if you look at, for example, the procession fresco from the Minoan civilization, it is not like later figures, on a pedestal, much, much bigger than those groveling in front of them. The center of it is a woman, a priestess. Her arms are raised in benediction, and they're on the same level as a row of male priests coming toward her. So you see a completely different view of power, empowering rather than disempowering. And the fact that's a partnership trend, that we today have that language, but we haven't known where to put it. It goes as a trend towards partnership, changes in language. And it's very important that we change our language, that we start using terms like domination system and partnership system, and stop perpetuating the old thinking.
Yes, Yeah. I mean, this book links very much to your latest book, Nurturing Humanity, which, many people do think that we're been conditioned to believe that, humanity is basically bad.
Right.
And as you mentioned, the selfish gene, it's all about me. And that isn't true. I mean, research shows that is not true at all.
Well, and this is one of the books of my husband, of David Loy, Darwin's Lost Theory, really is so important because he did the pioneering work, David Loy did, on what Darwin wrote about human evolution. In his book, The Descent of Man, he wrote, I am now going to talk about human evolution. And at that level, random selection loses its importance. He apologized for using the term survival of the fittest, which wasn't his term, it was actually Spencer's, but Darwin used it in his earlier book. But, Darwin said very clearly that at the human level, other factors, culture, begin to have more importance. And this is something that we've got to understand, that we certainly see some culture even in other species, certainly in apes, our closest. And it's interesting, by the way, because in Sacred Pleasure, the chapter 2, I deal with a species of apes called bonobos, remember?
Yes.
And, we hear so much about the common chimp, the common chimpanzee, but the bonobo is just as closely related to us. They have about 96.5% of the same DNA as humans do, but there's so much difference. They're not violent. They use sex as a sharing. They share food. The chimps don't do that. But you pick your animal species, don't you? To show, well, this is what humans are like. And it's been the wrong species. We have a choice.
Yeah, you mentioned David's book. I had it further down the list, but we can talk about that now if you want. I mean, I'll say a little bit about David. I mean, he was a psychologist, a social research specialist, scientist, evolutionary systems scientist, a prolific author, dozens and dozens of books, including the national award-winning book, The Healing of a Nation, and of course, Your Much Loved Husband. And I didn't know that there was a lost theory of love, let alone that it was Darwin's lost theory.
And we have to bring that knowledge out, because in what David did is something very interesting. The conventional index of descent of man has 2 entries for love. But if you actually do a scan of digitally, of the manuscript, he mentions it many, 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 many more times than he does selfishness. And as I said, he apologizes, even Darwin, for using the term survival of the fittest, which was also misinterpreted as survival of the meanest, those on top, etc. That's not true. I mean, we know. And today, you see, David self-published that book, Darwin's Lost Theory, and I am going to put it together, his work, and really, because he died 2 days after our 45th anniversary of our meeting, and we were inseparable after we met. And David wrote me so much poetry. He was amazing. It is very, very hard. He died 6 weeks ago.
I'm sure it is very, very hard.
Yeah, it's very
hard. But he's left a wonderful legacy. A wonderful
legacy. And I'm going to see to it that legacy really is disseminated.
So the next book is an update of a feminist classic that became famous for its groundbreaking demonstration of how sexual stereotypes restrict men's and women's psychological development. The book is Toward a New Psychology of Women by Jean Baker Miller. I think that one was originally published in 1977 and then more recently was updated. So tell us about this book.
Well, it had a real impact on me. So did Kate Miller's book, which I should have mentioned. But Jean Baker Miller really showed how both men and women have this yearning for connection, and how that gets suppressed, compartmentalized in both men and women, actually, but more in men. And of course, I think one of the books I mentioned was In a Different Voice. Do I have that book as part of it?
You do have In a Different Voice. Yes, it is the next book. Yes.
Yes, because they really sort of follow each other. How women tend to look at morality not in abstract terms, but I would paraphrase this as in caring terms. What is it that is needed to comfort, to heal, to care for, rather than some abstract principle or other? And that was a real breakthrough that Carol Gilligan made in that book.
Yeah.
But it is, I want to emphasize that it's a matter of socialization. And even the stereotypical male socialization of domination system, which is, of course, now being like a woman, right? It's a sort of a negative thing. And therefore, the devaluation of anything stereotypically considered feminine, like caring, caregiving, nonviolence. Even with that, there are so many men, like David was, who are caring, who are loving. It's part of our humanity.
Yeah. It is indeed.
And the men's movement is very important, which is a movement to reclaim men's humanity. And again, a very important partnership trend that's not recognized, because the thing is that we really need to look at these foundational matters.
It seems to, back in the sort of 80s and the 90s, we had, there was a lot of talk about men's movements, John Bly's book, I Am John, lots of gatherings and retreats. And then that seemed to die down for, quite a few decades, and appears to be coming back now, I think.
Oh, it's very much coming back, and in a different form than John Gray, because John Gray still brought into the stereotypes. Yes. Women are like this and men are like that, and that's why they can't. And he didn't emphasize socialization enough. I mean, I know John, and he's a lovely man, and I think that, his heart was in the right place. I believe that, but the book is misleading in that it sort of paints us as being like in cast iron stereotypes, and we're not. I
remember so many women talking about, oh yes, my husband's in his man cave. That they got that from the book, because
That's right.
Oh yes, he needs his time in his man cave before he comes out and joins the family.
Yeah, and that's really not so. I mean, but you see, we have and the Real Wealth of Nations, of course, as you know, exposes what I call a hidden system of gendered values that has affected very much what we count as economically valuable. And
yes.
And we have to, again, this is another reason why gender is so important, because if you really think about it, we have a system that ignores the three life-sustaining economic sectors: the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. And that is crazy. But it's reflected in GDP and GNP, in our metrics. That's why we at the Center for Partnerships Systems are developing new metrics called social wealth indicators and a social wealth index that shows the economic value of the work that both Marx and Smith, the father of capitalism, the father of socialism, ignored, marginalized. I mean, for them, it was this work of caring for people, starting at birth, keeping a clean and healthy, natural, home environment, which then translates into, of course, a natural environment, keeping a clean and healthy, natural. There's nothing about caring about our life support systems in either Marx or Smith. Very interesting. And as for the work of caring for people starting at birth and keeping this clean and healthy home environment, that work they both believed was to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. And GDP, therefore, does not include the value of this work. Now, again, there are partnership trends. When President Biden talks about the caring economy, a term that I coined in this 2007 book, he kind of narrows it to only talk about the care economy, direct care, rather than an economy that has as its goal what it should have, which is caring for people starting at birth and caring for a natural life support system. But what he's proposing to give visibility and value to childcare, to parenting, that is, and when he talks about human infrastructure, which is a term I also coined back in 2007, these are partnership trends. Now, there's a lot of resistance, but that resistance is the domination system trying to maintain and reassert itself.
One of the books on your list is The Price of Motherhood, Why the Most Important Job in the World is Still the Least Valued, by Anne Crittenden. Very provocative book. She's an award-winning journalist, and she argues that although women have been liberated, mothers have not.
And she is right, of course, because the model for, quote, women to be liberated is becoming more like a man, right? And
exactly.
And really fitting into an economy that has been structured to give no value, no economic value to the work that actually, and this is really very important, and it's brought out in The Real Wealth of Nations. The subtitle is Creating a Caring Economics. I propose that we need a free market. We don't have one, and yes, we need enlightened government policies, but they have to be partnership policies rather than domination policies. But we need to go beyond them to what I call a caring economics of partnerism. And the thing is that for our post-industrial knowledge service era, economists who live in a completely absurd universe, in which this very productive work of caring for people starting at birth is called reproductive, as it is in both socialist and capitalist theory, rather than productive, which is then reflected in our metrics. That work, actually, economists tell us that in this post-industrial knowledge service era, the most important capital, they say, is high-quality human capital. And we know from neuroscience that whether we do or do not have these flexible, creative people who can work in teams rather than just taking or giving orders, who are resilient, it largely hinges on the quality of care and education in the first 5 years, on this so-called women's work that is considered just reproductive in conventional economic thinking. So we've got a lot of changing to do. And if you go to our website of the Center for Partnership Systems, there are some wonderful graphics on caring economy. Go to the media kit and you'll find all kinds of graphics. We have a wonderful young graphics person who does them. And this is really a roadmap, as Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, to that future that we have all been yearning for.
Yeah, and humanity is yearning for it, even more so now, I think. The 10th book in your list, we've covered some of the others, rather quickly, but the 10th book, for me, it is a change in genre, but it carries the beautiful message that is in all of these books that you've chosen here. And it was written by your husband, David.
Yes.
2 years ago. And this is a very sweet book because he's basically using offbeat humor and fables to bind kids and teens and adults and grandparents in a common cause. This must be a book that's very close to your heart.
It's very close to my, excuse me, to my heart. It's Grandfather's Garden by David Loye, Loye. And it's on Amazon, of course, and you can get it. It's close to my heart for many reasons. One is that it really expresses so much whimsy, which David had an incredible, as you say, offbeat sense of humor. But it also expresses so much caring and so much warmth and so much striving. Like the one story is about a baby carrot who wanted to be a race boat driver. I mean, think of that. It's like off the wall, but it really isn't. But these are stories because I have insomnia, and David used to make up stories for me. And eventually, these are the stories that are in Grandfather's Garden that he put together in this absolutely wonderful book for both children and grown-ups. That I think it makes a wonderful gift for people of all ages.
And I'm just going to read a little bit here about the book. The need for a powerful, new, moral, action-oriented unity of mind is highlighted by how the all-seeing, all-knowing mythwump bursts out of the central story in Grandfather's Garden to call for deep, driving change. The mythwump tells us we just can't take it anymore. It's time for the best of us in Storyland to break out into your real world to save you with a playful, peaceful, but powerful new revolution of joy versus gloom.
And David's life really was so dedicated to making ours a better world. And we share that passion, both of us. We shared many, many wonderful times, many travels to all over the world, including Africa. And I cling to those memories because I really thought David would live forever, but he didn't. And he died, and he wanted to die. His quality, he had some infections, landed him in the hospital, and after that he required 24/7 care. And it was no quality of life for him anymore. And
David's work will never die.
David's work will never die, and I will do my darndest to ensure that.
Yeah. On your website, it says, I think it's on the Center for Partnership website, it says Riane Eisler was so far ahead. Now she is right on time. And the message that you've been sharing with the world for a long time now, which is, updated. and even made even more relevant in Nurturing Humanity, your most recent book. You know, we've learned over the past 2 years how critical the need for partnership is. I think, we needed the pandemic to shake us up and show us that. Tell me how we all need to work together and why now more than ever.
Well, in nurturing our humanity, and by the way, it is nurturing our humanity, the title, the last chapter is about 4 cornerstones identified by my research and also the research of others. And they're foundational to either partnership or domination systems. Now, I've already mentioned so many trends going in a partnership direction, because the headlines, of course, are always about the bad things and the violence. 12 people died and 14 people were killed. And I mean, but that's not what's happening. Yes, that's happening, but what's really newsworthy is the movement to shift our paradigm, our worldview, and our rules of what is rewarded and isn't rewarded, and what is discouraged at the same time, which are many of the things like overconsumption is an attempt to fulfill our human yearning for caring connection, and the domination system always gets in the way. So the inequalities widen rather than narrowing. And of course, we know from many studies now that even those on top are insecure in systems where there is wide inequality. So what are these 4 cornerstones? And I've already mentioned them. One is childhood. I cannot emphasize how important the trend away from authoritarian and violent, punitive parenting to authoritative, because children do need limits, they need rules, there's no question about it, but nonviolent, based not so much on shame and blame and punishment, but on really bringing out our full humanity in both girls and boys is. And again, nurturing our humanity has so much about the neuroscience, about how the so-called pleasure centers in our brain light up more when we share and care than when we win and dominate. But we have to have an environment that doesn't suppress that and reward the opposite. So that takes me to gender. I've already said that the ranking of male form over female form, which is the fundamental difference in our species, is a template for in-group versus out-group, superior, inferior, dominated, being served, serving, thinking, and acting. And we've got to connect these dots. And we also have to really look at the gendered system of values and change it. And again, there are trends in that direction. I mean, all over, but they're getting some press, which is good, but not as major news, as sort of a sidebar. At least they're there, because when I still remember when all we had about women was a so-called women's section. Remember? I mean, you may be too young to remember, but I remember that.
I remember.
Gender is fundamental. It isn't, quote, just a women's issue or just a men's issue. It's a social issue. The next thing is economics. We've talked about that, about the need to really retain the partnership elements of both capitalism and socialism, but leave this gendered system of values embedded in them behind, and change our economics to a caring economics of partnerism. And the 4th cornerstone, not surprisingly, is story and language. And we've already spoken about the vital importance of leaving behind and never showing a child again this caveman cartoon. It is toxic. and it is a lie. But also language, linguistic psychologists tell us something very important, which is that the categories provided by a culture's language channel our thinking. This is true of social categories, like right, left, religious, secular, northern, southern, whatever, because it's almost impossible, if you use those categories that fragment our thinking, to really visualize the partnership alternative. So we must switch our language to partnership systems, domination systems, hierarchies of domination versus hierarchies of actualization. And yes, a caring economics of partnerism. And there's lots about language on our website too. So I invite everybody. Many of us are already working to shift, but we have to do so consciously.
Yes, yeah. You set up the Centre for Partnership Systems. What sort of resources do you offer people?
Oh, we offer many resources. First of all, we offer a wonderful online free access. It's not free access, you pay for it, but it is anytime access. Anytime you want course called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives, 4 videos that I did with some tremendous resource materials. But the whole site itself is full of resources. We are working on developing, as I said, we already developed the first iteration of social wealth economic indicators, but there are 52 of those. And we're trying now to work to condense them into a social wealth index. We welcome support, financial, and we need financial support. We're a 501c3. We're a not-for-profit organization. The site is full of resources, and I could go on and on, but I just invite people to look at it, look at the media kit, use, if you take the course, for example, and some groups have purchased the course, then you can use the videos and all of the materials and replicate it. Change the conversation. That's the first step. Change your thinking is really the first step, your consciousness. Work on whatever you are passionate about, but don't ignore the 4 cornerstones. Because what we have seen is movement towards partnership, but the domination systems have always rebuilt themselves on these 4 foundations. If you look at Hitler's Germany, all of them have one thing in common, for example, which is maintaining or strengthening an authoritarian, male-dominated, highly punitive family, which is directly connected to an authoritarian, male-dominated, highly punitive state.
Yes. And we are seeing many countries almost reverting back to authoritarianism, or as if they are trying very hard to revert back to those conditions. Yes. I mean, right now we're seeing something being played out on the world stage with Russia.
That's correct.
I mean, do you think this is we're seeing more of it because they're responding to the opposite? Do you think that it's kind of like the dying throes of authoritarianism, just, shaking, rattling the saber one more time? Or do you feel that there really is a huge schism taking place?
Well, I think that it is a number of factors. One of them is what you mentioned, which is the threat to them. Because if you're brought up, and really this is detailed in Nurturing Our Humanity, what happens to the brain, to a child in a highly punitive, domination-oriented, authoritarian family. Denial is what happens, for example. So you get climate change denial, you get election result denial, you get COVID-19 denial. I mean, it's all there. but it is also because of the tremendous swiftness of the technological shift from an industrial to a post-industrial economy. And these people are clinging to the voice of authority, which they've been told, their pastors, a Trump or an Orban. And that's okay, but there are a lot of people who are not doing that, who are really searching, especially young people. Some, quite a few older people too. But young people know that we need a different system. And that takes us back to the 4 cornerstones, because these are foundations of either we have to shift the foundations from domination to partnership in childhood, gender, economics, and story and language. And then we will not have these regressions. But that's the long term. The short term is just what people are doing. Vote, very important. Make your voice heard, change the conversation, change the policies. I mean, vote for people whose policies will really support caring for children, which is the most important human work, isn't it?
That's where it all begins.
That's where it all begins, and where we know from neuroscience what an effect it has. Oh, and we have wonderful resources about parenting. We have a caring and connected parenting guide in both short guide based on the latest neuroscience in both English and Spanish that you can download for free from centerforpartnership.org. So the resources for everything are there. And right now we're working with the Ford Foundation on a project of developing a partnership technology checklist, because the emerging new technologies really will depend on how they're developed and how they are programmed. So we have a checklist of where does your project fit on this scale. Yeah. And it's a number of items that we're working on. So resources galore.
You mentioned earlier that President Biden has used a number of the phrases, that you coined. Is he showing any real evidence of following some of the things that the Center for Partnership is recommending?
Oh, I think that his heart is in the right place, and that he understands one of his major advisors, Bernstein, gave a wonderful comment on the real wealth of nations. And I think that that's how he has been going in this very realistic direction, understanding that if we don't care for our natural life support systems, if we don't care for children, if we don't provide sound parenting, sound education, partnership-oriented parenting and education, we really don't have much of a future worth living in. Or maybe not a future at all.
Indeed. Before we close, tell us, what are you reading now?
What am I reading? I'm reading David's poetry. He wrote me the first 100 days that we were together. He wrote me a poem a day. And I'm writing the background to his poems. So that's what I'm reading. And it's wonderful reading. His poems are a balm for a broken heart.
Wow. A poem a day for the first 100 days. That's something that a lot of men can certainly do their best to live up to. And I'm sure it's something that a lot of women would very much welcome.
Well, I certainly welcomed it. And I think it might be on Amazon, because he put them all in a book called 100 Days of Love.
Did you write a poem a day for him?
No, I didn't. I'm not a poet. But I gave him a lot of love, and David was my home. And I'm going to start crying soon if we keep talking about him.
Riane Eisler.
I want him to live forever in our memory, and he certainly will. I'll do my best to see to that.
Riane Eisler, thank you so much for adding your 10 best spiritual books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations. They're not exactly spiritual, but they are spiritual.
Well, they're
not obviously spiritual.
They're very spiritual. And that's what people tell me about these books. People tell me that my books have changed their lives.
Well, I have to say, people are always asking me to write my 10 best. I don't think I could write a list of 10, maybe a list of 100, but I can definitely say that you're the three, The Chalice and the Blade, Sacred Pleasure, and Nurturing Humanity would definitely be on my list.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandie.
Thank you for being with us. I really appreciate the time that you've given us, especially under the current circumstances. And we send you...
As I said, I want to honor David's memory, and I want to continue my work. And I thank you, Sandie. It's been a pleasure to be with you and with our audience.
Thank you. So the courses, programs and resources, lots of things you can get at the Centre for Partnership at centreforpartnership.org. You can also learn more about Riane Eisler's work and her books at her website, rianeeisler.com. That brings us to the end of this week's show. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and I'll be back at the same time next week with another 10 Best Spiritual Books interview. Till then, it's goodbye from me.